Today we'll examine the 4 questions of economic systems. This is for Alabama Civics Standard 7. Determine how people organize economic systems to address basic economic questions regarding which goods and services will be produced, how they will be distributed, and who will consume them. Using economic concepts to explain historical and current developments and issues in global, national, state, or local context. For example, increase in oil prices resulting from supply and demand. And analyzing agriculture, tourism, and urban growth in Alabama for their impact on economic development. Economics is a study of the production, consumption, and distribution of resources. 4 basic questions define economic systems. We will examine an example of how economics influenced historical events, and we will discuss agriculture, tourism, and urban growth in Alabama and their impact on economic development. The 4 basic economic questions. These must be answered by any economic system. What goods and services will be produced? How will goods and services be produced? How much or how many will be produced? Who gets the goods and services produced? And we'll look at a traditional economy, market economies, and command economies in terms of these 4 questions. A traditional economy is one that is based on traditional agriculture, usually very primitive. A command economy would be a socialist or communist economy where the government plans the economy. And a market economy allows market forces of supply and demand, and therefore price, to be determined by the market with little or no regulation. A traditional economy has little technological innovation. Technology remains about the same from generation to generation. If you imagine being on a time machine and you go back to 3000 BC in Egypt and people are farming with primitive instruments, you go forward 1,000 years, you're not going to see a big difference. The farming will be very similar. Things change very, very slowly, if at all, in a traditional economy. They use primitive tools and techniques for subsistence farming. By subsistence, we mean growing enough to eat. Maybe a little bit extra, but probably not a lot. The name of the game in a traditional economy is don't starve. Grow enough food to live. And if you've done that, you're going to be fairly happy. Because some years you won't. Some years family members might starve because you can't grow enough food. It's usually rural, because you have to have the land to grow the food. Wealth and jobs are often inherited. Why does he get to be the chief or the king or the pharaoh? Because his grandfather and great-grandfather and so forth had those jobs. So the wealth and jobs are inherited, and there's often not much chance for a person to move up in society. What to produce? Focus on the production of food, because they are inefficient and do not produce enough excess food to support much specialization of labor. Most people are farmers, a few might be craftsmen, and a very small group may serve as religious or political leaders. In a traditional economy, how to produce. Traditional economies use the same methods to produce goods, mainly food, from generation to generation. The most primitive remain hunters and gatherers. They go out in the woods, they hunt game, maybe trap, they gather berries, and more advanced traditional economies have adopted agriculture. They plant, they grow, they harvest, they have villages. In a traditional economy, how much to produce? Traditional economies may struggle to produce enough food to avoid starvation. The lack of technology limits production, because resources are not multiplied by the use of technology. In economics, technology is called the resource multiplier. You get more from the same resources through technology. So let's take the land resource. One man with hand tools can't grow that much food and can't farm that many acres of land. One man with an ox and better tools can farm more land. But a man with a tractor can farm many times the amount of land that a man with an ox can farm. So technology gets more food from the same amount of land, or lets one man farm far more land. It multiplies the usefulness of both the labor, the man who's working, and the land that he works to get more food. Traditional economy, who gets what? In traditional economies, families struggle to produce most of the things they need, including clothing and tools. Your tools are probably handmade at home. Your clothing is probably handmade at home. Excess food, when available, may be traded for goods the family cannot produce, such as horseshoes or nails made by the village blacksmith. Even in a traditional economy, you may have some specialization of labor. That is, some people, like the blacksmith, who, rather than producing food, produce other goods and trade for the food. Inheritance decides who gets land, jobs, and leadership status. Moving along, we have the command economy. So we've covered the traditional economy of primitive agriculture, what you might have found among the Aztecs or the Incas or tribes in remote places in the world today. But then we have the command economy. This is more like Soviet Russia, communist China, back perhaps in the 1970s. A command economy is controlled by central planners and a government. Supply and price are decided by government bureaucrats. Command economies promise economic security and stability through planning, but that means limiting freedom. Historically, this has not worked. The Soviet Union was a planned economy. The Soviet Union ran on 5-year plans. They would draw up a plan and run the plan for 5 years. And the plan would call for producing, say, 10,000 refrigerators at this factory. Well, what if they needed 20,000 refrigerators? Well, the plan said 5 years, 10,000 refrigerators. That's it. You stick with the plan. So the plan was not responsive to the needs of the people. The plan didn't factor in supply and price and demand the way a market economy would. All that's set by the government. And if the supply of something perhaps was less than they anticipated, the plan didn't really allow for a lot of flexibility with that. So planning is very difficult in a highly complex system such as an economy. Things happen that the planners cannot possibly anticipate. This limits the effectiveness of planning. What do you produce in a command economy? Whatever the government says. So it doesn't matter if people need refrigerators but not ovens. If the plan says to produce ovens, you're going to make the ovens and not the refrigerators. The plan is not responsive to the needs of the consumers, the needs of the people. How to produce. The government decides how goods and services will be produced. The government plans the means of production, they plan out the factory, and the factory runs according to those plans. There's not a lot of incentive to be more efficient or effective in manufacturing. So without that incentive, the managers of the factories don't make their factories more efficient. Therefore, there's more waste in a command economy. How much to produce? The government decides how much to produce. You have the same problem here that you had in other areas. The government may not be able to anticipate how much is needed. So some families may do without because the plan didn't call for enough to be produced. On the other hand, The plan might call for too much to be produced, and you've wasted resources because you produced things that weren't needed. The problem with planning is that no one knows the future. No one knows how much might be needed. So an inflexible plan, especially over a long term like 5 years, that was never really an effective way to run an economy. And the Soviet Union finally ground down under the weight of this planning and collapsed in 1991. Who gets what in a command economy? Guess who decides? The government. The government decides who gets the goods and services that are produced. Historically, the Communist Party members got the best and most of what was produced, leaving their comrades to stand in long lines from stores with mostly empty shelves. I can remember seeing on the news when I was young and the Soviet Union was still around, pictures of people lining up at 4 o'clock in the morning to wait in line all day to buy bread. And by the time they got to their place in line to buy the bread might be gone because the planners hadn't planned correctly for the supply of bread, or they couldn't produce enough bread because they weren't being very efficient with their resources. So under communism, people didn't get what they needed. Now, if you're in the Communist Party, you probably did get what you needed, especially if you were higher up in the party. George Orwell, the novelist, wrote a novel called Animal Farm about this, what he saw with Soviet Russia. And in Soviet Russia, he compared Soviet Russia to a farm where the animals kicked the owner of the farm, the old Tsar of Russia, off the farm. And the animals ran the farm. Well, the pigs were a little bit smarter than the other animals. So eventually the pigs took over the farm. They moved into the house. They started wearing clothes. And it became difficult to tell the pigs from the former owners of the farm. And that was to criticize the Communist Party. They kicked out the czars, but then they took the best of everything, and they ruled over the people like they were the czars. In the end, the people were no better off. In fact, they were probably a little bit worse off. But the Communist Party members got more and better things because they had taken over the leadership role that had been held by the old nobility and royalty of Imperial Russia. And then we have a market economy. This is more like the United States. Now, the United States is not a pure market economy. We're more of a mixed economy. We have some aspects of planning and management by the government, but far less than a place like Soviet Russia would have had. And for the most part, we allow the market to operate, although we do regulate it somewhat heavily. Market economies are free from government interference. A pure market economy would be free from government interference and operate on the basis of supply and demand. The government has a laissez-faire policy. It does not attempt to manage the economy in a true market economy. This was more the United States of the 1800s, the 19th century. The government didn't get involved in economics a great deal. For the most part, people traded without a lot of government interference, and the market was free to operate. In a market economy, what to produce? That's decided by the consumers through demand. If more consumers want and will buy some good or service, businesses will be attracted into the market and fulfill consumer wants. If consumers lose interest in a good or service, the businesses providing these have to find another niche or go out of business. For example, the buggy whip industry. Over 100 years ago, buggy whips were needed because people rode around in horse-driven buggies, and you needed a whip to crack over the tops of the horses' heads and get the horses to move. Well, when the cars came along, you don't really need a buggy whip to pop over the engine of your car. So buggy whip makers had to make some hard choices. Perhaps some looked at these new horseless carriages and thought, well, this is just a fad. The horse has been around for thousands of years. People will always use horses because they've always used horses in the past, so we'll stay in the buggy whip industry. Others probably looked at the situation and said, well, we do make buggy whips, but we're a leather goods industry. Perhaps, instead of making buggy whips, we'll make the leather car seats for these cars. Those companies would have stayed in business, the buggy whip makers perhaps not. What made that decision? Was it a government policy? No, it was consumers. Consumers wanted cars. They didn't need buggy whips. The demand for buggy whips went down. The demand for car seats went up. Car seat makers stayed in business. Buggy whip makers went out of business. How do you produce in a market economy? Producers must find efficient ways to produce goods to keep costs low, therefore increasing profits or permitting lower prices to compete with similar businesses for consumers. In a market economy, it's up to the producers to keep costs low. If you're inefficient and you have to charge customers a high price for your goods and your competitors don't, your customers will probably go over to your competitors and buy from them because they can save money. You'll go out of business if you don't find ways to be as efficient or more efficient than your competition. So businesses are always looking for ways to be more efficient with their resources. Without any government intervention, without any government policy being involved, businesses become more and more efficient to compete. The competition drives it, not policies. So they're always looking for a better way to produce the goods. The means of production constantly improve because of the forces of the market: supply, demand, and price. In a market economy, how much do you produce? Consumer demand decides how much or how many of a particular good or service will be produced. Excess product may be sold for a loss, but companies that overestimate consumer demand may go out of business. The ideal in manufacturing is just on time. A manufacturer wants to produce goods just in time to immediately sell them into the market. Storing goods in a warehouse costs money. Warehouse space is expensive. It has to be paid for. It has to be rented or purchased. So it's much less expensive. You can produce just enough that you need for that day, sell that, and have none left over. If a company does overproduce, in the end, they'll have to sell those units for a loss, perhaps, or even just destroy them and completely eat the lost revenue. So in a market economy, the amount produced is going to closely match the amount needed, or the producers will suffer for it. To make sure that doesn't happen, producers do very careful analysis of what is needed in the market and try very hard not to overproduce or underproduce. In a market economy, who gets what? Again, it's decided by consumers whether to buy a good or service at a particular price. Those able and willing to purchase an available item are free to do so, within some limits. Some things are illegal: drugs, explosives, so forth. But within the boundaries of the law, and perhaps licensing in some cases, or permits, for most goods and services, people can simply buy what they're able to afford, what they have the money to purchase, and what they want to a particular price. Now, price affects demand, and demand affects price. If the price becomes too high for something, the demand goes down because people simply can't afford it, or just don't want to give it that much money for it, or they substitute something less expensive for that particular item. Perhaps the price of steak goes very high, and people eat more chicken. But demand also affects price. If people really want something, the price will go up because of the higher demand. So if people really, really want steak, if perhaps a new diet book comes out, it's very popular, and it says steak is a thing you should eat every meal, then people buy more steak, but that will also tend to drive the price higher because more people are competing for the same goods. So they will bid the price up against each other. If the supply is reduced and the demand is high, the price is going to go up. If, on the other hand, the supply goes way up and the demand is about the same, the price will come down. That's the law of supply and demand. The greater the supply, given the same demand, the lower the price. The greater the demand, given the same supply, the higher the price. And the higher the price, usually the lower the demand, because fewer people can afford the item. The price of petroleum. Let's take an example here, petroleum. Now, petroleum is the crude oil found in the earth. Petroleum is distilled into many other products, gasoline, kerosene, so forth. And it was once seen as a nuisance. People digging water wells cursed their luck when they found it. So a plantation owner in Louisiana before the Civil War digging a well for water would be very unhappy to find petroleum on their land because the petroleum was worthless, but they needed water. The invention of the automobile created a demand for gasoline, which is refined from petroleum. So with the increased use of the automobile, the petroleum was needed to fuel automobiles, so the demand for petroleum went up, therefore the price of petroleum went up. The increased demand and naturally limited supply greatly increased the price of petroleum. Now, the price of gasoline fluctuates up and down for a number of reasons. It can be speculation in the market, those people thinking its gas is going to be worth more than buying it, actually making it more expensive. It can be the value of the dollar. Gasoline is traded in U.S. dollars in international markets. If the dollar is stronger, that is, the dollar is worth more, then the gas is relatively worth less, so the price we pay at the pump goes lower. If we found a vast new reservoir of gasoline in an easily accessible place, or excuse me, petroleum that we'd refined to gasoline in an easily accessible place, then the supply would go up and the price would tend to come down. But over time, as more people in the world can afford cars, as more people drive, the price of gasoline, assuming we continue to use engines that run on gasoline and don't switch to, say, electric motors, the price of gasoline will tend to go up over time because of the increased demand and the fact that we're not really making any more. The earth isn't producing more gasoline, not at the rate we consume it anyway. So eventually we will run out of petroleum. There are different estimates on how long that will take, and more than likely we'll just find some other power supply and switch over to that. Alabama agriculture. Alabama agriculture has always been important to the economy of the state. We've always been a farm state. Before the Civil War, cotton was king in the South, including Alabama. The demand for cotton was fueled by the textile industry of the United Kingdom and the northern United States. So the factories were in the United Kingdom, England, and in the northern United States, and the South grew the cotton in the fields. The boll weevil devastated the cotton fields in the 1930s and forced Alabama to diversify into other crops. So when the boll weevil came through and devastated the cotton fields, Alabama farmers switched into other things that they could grow, and that made our economy more diverse. Today, a drop in the price of cotton is not as devastating to our state as it would have been before the boll weevil. And that's why in Enterprise they have the boll weevil monument. Even though the boll weevil was a curse to the cotton farmers, it broke our dependency on a single crop for our economy. It gave us a more diverse economy. That is, we had more sources of income, so a loss of any one source, say cotton, did not entirely devastate the state. Alabama tourism. Alabama has recently developed tourism. The natural beauty of the mountains and beaches attracts some tourists. Others come for historical sites or the southern cuisine, such as the Alabama Barbecue Trail. The Robert Trent Jones Golf Trail brings golfers from snowbound states for winter play. If you're up in Michigan or Wisconsin or some other cold snowbound state, you don't get to golf during the winter because of the snow, but if you come down to the south on perhaps your winter break, then you can enjoy some golf because here we're very unlikely to have a lot of snow on the ground. Alabama urban growth. Alabama, long a mainly rural state, has seen urban growth in the last century. The emergence of the steel industry in Birmingham created many jobs. People moved from rural areas to take those jobs, greatly increasing the population of the city. Birmingham is the largest city in Alabama with around 1 million people in the metro area. The location of state government in Montgomery created civil service jobs, attracting workers from rural areas to the city. So many people took jobs in state government. The offices were in Montgomery, so they moved to Montgomery. Mobile grew as a port city through trade on the Gulf of Mexico and beyond. People who worked in the port, who worked in shipping, moved to Mobile to get those jobs. And Dothan grew as a rail hub for regional agriculture. In southeast Alabama, Dothan got the rail system going through there, so farmers would bring in their crops on their wagons or later their trucks, and then they would ship those out through rail to their destination. In conclusion, traditional economies are almost a thing of the past. Command economies promise equality, but they deliver misery. They fail to bring equality as political connections give some more than others, mainly the party members. Such economies depend on violence and coercion. They only function if people are so scared they're afraid to stand up to their government and demand their freedom. When people find their courage, as in the old Soviet Union, they rise up and take their country back, and the communist government collapses. Market economies permit some to grow rich and others to fall into poverty. However, they at least offer the possibility of gaining wealth. Economics may explain many historical events. Alabama's economy has changed from one based mainly on rural cotton farming to a more diverse economy that is more urban, industrial, and service-oriented.